Hi, this is Sandra Brown with the Institute for Relational Harm Reduction and Public Pathology Education. I'm also the current president of the Association for MPD and Psychopathy Survivor Treatment, Research, and Education. So today I'm just going to talk a little bit about the issues of cognitive dissonance. And so if we have any new listeners that are not part of some of our online programs, such as the Living Recovery Program, I'll give you a very quick background. My book, How to Spot a Dangerous Man Before You Get Involved, came out in 2005. And one of the dangerous man types that I talked about was called the emotional predator. And that was basically about the narcissistic and psychopathic person. And I introduced the concept of dangerousness related to these cluster B personality disorder types and the problems within the relationship. Following that, and an enormous amount of inquiry and interest in that particular dangerous man type, the emotional predator, I went ahead and expanded into another book about this in more detail. And so in 2008, Women Who Love Psychopaths Inside the Relationships of Inevitable Harm came out. And so those two books were the first books that introduced this concept about the intimate partner relationships with the higher end spectrum, if you will, of psychopathology. And since that time, the field has sort of grown into calling it narcissistic or psychopathic abuse or narcissistic abuse recovery. I actually named in those books these relationships as pathological love relationships. And that's a whole other chat that I might record and talk about why the naming of it is important. But nonetheless, so these two books were the first books to examine those types of relationships. And I guess what was surprising to me was when I began to write the Women Who Love Psychopaths book, I went looking for information on these relationships. And I mean, clinical kind of information or professional journal articles, and there was absolutely zero. I had begun working with these survivors decades ago. I initially ran a personality disorder clinic for people with cluster B disorders and or psychopathy. And of course, because the relationships are notoriously bad, they often brought their partners in because of that, because of the relationship problems. And we eventually began a program for the partners of cluster Bs. And so we began, treating these victim survivor partners a number of decades ago. And so I just naturally assumed that if we were doing that and collecting data on them and trying to figure out their trauma and, doing some case studies and just, digging in deeper to understand this, that certainly somebody else was probably also doing that. So when I began to write the book, Women Who Love Psychopaths, and antisocials and sociopaths and narcissists, I was shocked to find no other books out there about the intimate partner dynamics, the traits of the survivor that was being targeted, the differences in their trauma that was different than like typical post-traumatic stress, and just some of the unique features about these types of relationships. And so when I began looking, there were no other books, and I did not find any professional journal articles about any of that, the relationship dynamics, the traits of survivors that were being targeted, and anything about their unique trauma. And so these books have been called seminal because they were the first books that introduced this new concept about why these cluster B relationships need to be differentiated from simply bad relationships or abusive relationships, that there were some critical differences. So, fast forward a couple of decades after working with these survivors in group and individual, and these books coming out, the thing that the Institute began to really hone in on was the differences in their trauma and the presentation of their trauma to other therapists who were regularly misidentifying or not catching some of the idiosyncrasies. They automatically were thinking some of the presentation was other things attributed to codependency or traditional PTSD or bipolar or dependent personality. There was a lot of misreading of the unusual presentations, symptoms, trauma symptoms in these survivors. And so that sort of began the leg of work that we've been on, over the last coming up on 2 decades of really trying to identify how these survivors' trauma is different. And so the number one thing that I addressed in the earlier books were up to, in the Women Who Love Psychopaths, we're on the 3rd edition. So in those books leading up to this 3rd edition, I talked about, this issue of cognitive dissonance. And this was not a quick identification for me. So if we go back, a number of decades ago, when I began working with them, I noticed this cognitive problem that they had, that it was very hard for them to stay on the same page with one consistent view of the partner, and that they tended to bounce back and forth or ping pong back and forth between these thoughts, feelings, and even perceptions of the type of relationship they were in. And so, of course, that makes sense that when you have a Jekyll and Hyde personality that is very dichotomous or polar opposites in both parts of that relationship, that a survivor has a relationship eventually, with both sides of the Jekyll and Hyde persona. So there are parts that she loves, the charming and what we call love bombing, behavior, and then parts that she loathes that is the abuse and, you know, the horrendousness of that person's disorder, their personality disorder. And so it made sense that they were in two different relationships at the same time with one person and had two different relationship histories, one with Jekyll, one with Hyde, and two different emotions, two different thoughts, two different histories, to everything. And so, you know, it was represented in this cognitive problem of not being able to consistently hold this thing that this personality disorder is the predominant problem in the relationship. It would bounce back and forth between trusting and distrusting, and loving and loathing, and craving him or her and the relationship, and repulsion by the craving. And so there was an enormous amount of time spent in sessions with the survivor's own confusion about the state of their mind, of their cognition. And so when, you know, I began to look for answers about what that was, there was nothing written about it. And I had to, you know, dig out the psychology books and begin looking at what that was. Looking through defense mechanisms, for one, to see if something fit what it was that I was seeing. And so eventually, you know, I came across the word of cognitive dissonance, and I had been describing this holding of two different feelings and thoughts about the disordered partner as dichotomous, that on one hand they loved and on the other hand that they loathed. And so this dichotomous view, so it fit within the somewhat within the explanation of cognitive dissonance. But the problem is, and especially if you go back, you know, a couple decades, or even since the Dangerous Man book came out in 2005, or The Psychopath in 2008, there wasn't a lot of internet professional journal articles on cognitive dissonance. And so that term, dissonance, is actually falls within the category of social psychology. So it's sort of a study of how people deal with internal conflict. But all the information, the little bit of information that was out there back then, was about these social psychology experiments and the kinds of things that people tell themselves in order to feel less conflicted about something they're doing, you know, a part of their behavior that they know is wrong, but they're still doing it. And so the experiments were like smoking cessation. So everyone knows it's unhealthy to smoke. And so they tested people's cognitive dissonance about smoking. They know they shouldn't smoke. You know, the American surgeon's report is it causes cancer. So on the other hand, they say, well, I've cut back and at least I'm not smoking 20 cigarettes a day. I'm down to 2. And so anywhere where you read anything about cognitive dissonance were these experiments, these social psychology experiments with not intimate, personal, relational problems. It was smoking cessation, or it was about lying. One of the experiments was if they could pay people to tell a smaller lie and they felt okay about it, especially if they were paid, for instance, to view a product in a positive way. And so that's the kind of information that was out there when I was trying to figure out what these dichotomous thoughts, feelings, and perceptions a survivor had of their relationship. And so while the definition of cognitive dissonance matched, which is this conflict between your behavior and your value system, that fit for them. But anything else about the application of understanding cognitive dissonance with these people did not. We literally had to scratch out, our own understanding and applying that very general understanding of cognitive dissonance to something that was very, very different. And I think, a big part of our contribution to this field, this emerging field in narcissistic or psychopathic abuse, is figuring out what that symptom was, because all of my clients, had told me over the years that whatever that is that they could not name, that we hadn't figured out what it was the number one symptom that they had. Everybody said it. All the survivors had this one symptom, along with other, symptoms of like post-traumatic stress or other forms of anxiety, but they consistently had this thing. And they named it as traumatic to them to experience. And so even though if you looked up trauma, in a book or in the DSM, you would not find that listed. And yet all these survivors, hundreds of survivors over the years, were saying the same thing about how traumatic it was to them to experience the decline and the loss of their cognitive functioning. And so the inability to make decisions or judgment or hold a rational thought about the destructiveness of this relationship. And so that was all being influenced and deteriorating because of cognitive dissonance. So the information out there on cognitive dissonance was not about personal, intimate, important relationship things like the person that you've loved and spent 30 years with, or getting divorced and having to take your children away. It was studies about telling a white lie in an experiment on a product. And so it had never been studied to see what long-term, chronic, persistent, unrelenting cognitive dissonance about something very, very important to you does to you. Because a white lie is forgotten, 10 minutes after the experiment. And so that dissonance in that case dissipates. The dissonance, in these survivors that was going for decades, that became chronic and persistent and unrelenting, never dissipated. And so we never had a study about what that does, what it does to the mind, what it does to the brain, what it does to behavior, what it does to self-concept. And so our contribution, I think, to this has been spending the last over 10 years since the book came out and named cognitive dissonance as the #1 problem. We felt a responsibility beyond naming it to actually understand it, so that if that's the #1 symptom, we need to be figuring out some kind of treatment for this. And so we felt a responsibility, as the people who sort of uncovered what this symptom was and naming it, to actually find a better definition of how it operated traumatically in survivors' lives and their neuro condition, and the definition of their trauma. And so that's what we've been at, digging around in that over 10 years. And, honestly, what we uncovered, and some of that, there's a couple chapters in The Women Who Love Psychopaths, 3rd edition, the white cover book, a couple of chapters where we went into a lot of detail about what we found about cognitive dissonance, and our research, and naming that what causes this to be so problematic in these survivors is that there are multiple layers of cognitive dissonance related to the dissonance about the partner and the partner's disorder, dissonance about the relationship, it's good, it's bad, and then eventually dissonance about the survivor themselves. How did I do this? Why did I override my instincts? Why did this happen? And what part am I to blame in this? And so we began to, understand and label this dissonance as different, because of some of the layering effects of this. And then the really interesting part was when we did the research, our 3rd research, which was with Purdue University on the traits in survivors that get targeted, there was a connection between one of the super traits of personality that survivors have, that is this elevated personality trait that is targeted, and its relationship to how deeply or how severely, I guess that's a better word, how severely cognitive dissonance will develop in them and impact them. There is a connection we found between our research on their personalities and the severity of their cognitive dissonance. And so all of this began coming together as we spent intensely the last decade plus, really looking at how this dissonance is different in these survivors than dissonance that you see in other people. Sorry about that. That was my phone. So that's sort of where we are at with our research on dissonance, and our current work is about how to reduce that. So the interesting thing in our research about cognitive dissonance, and the little bit of research that's out there about it in the professional journal articles, is that there's a whole lot of writing about it as a social psychology theory, and almost nothing about how to reduce it or completely get rid of dissonance. And again, especially with, you know, survivors who have had this chronic, unrelenting, persistent dissonance that has caused a lot of trauma to them, you know, over months, years, or decades. And so even just on dissonance reduction, you know, in some of these silly experiments, there's very little written in depth about that. So that's been, you know, the hurdle we've been working on right now is effective treatment, not only for dissonance, because that has to be woven into the survivor's overall trauma treatment, but that dissonance has a rightful place, a prominent place in a survivor's treatment. And in fact, we've had lots of survivors who have gone to traditional trauma treatment when trauma therapists did not recognize this atypical symptom of cognitive dissonance and this type of survivor. So they just treated them as a typical trauma survivor with PTSD and did, you know, PTSD treatment and reduction. And even though survivors had, you know, a reduction in a lot of the symptoms of PTSD, they still had cognitive dissonance. And so, you know, a lot of them contacted us and said, is this normal for trauma treatment to not be effective? You know, and when I asked them what they meant by that, you know, all the symptoms associated with PTSD were in fact reduced. But what wasn't reduced was their atypical aspects associated with dissonance, which would not have been treated, you know, by a therapist who didn't know to treat it. And so that's kind of where we're at. You know, I read out on the internet about, everybody's talking about, you know, cognitive dissonance, not knowing the history of it or where it came from or how much research has gone into it, or where the understanding of it is headed next. And you will read bloggers and coaches and other survivors writing on and on about cognitive dissonance with not one suggestion other than no contact about how to reduce it. And that's because people don't know. And so, you know, just as an FYI, you know, the no contact thing certainly helps the brain, but that is not the complete resolution of the issue of no contact. And the reason you keep reading that associated with dissonance is because they don't have the answer for it. And so they're waiting on us to come up with the answer, and then they'll write about it, and then it'll be out there. So so that's sort of the story on dissonance, and that it is, you know, a very notable and traumatic experience for survivors to lose the functionality of their emotions and their brain, and to lose one of the things that we researched was dissonance influence on the executive functioning part of the brain, that it actually hits the, you know, impacts the part of the brain that's responsible for decision making and judgment and rationale. And so, You know, survivors are often judged for not leaving the relationship sooner, or what are you thinking? And families looking at you like, you know, why can't you make a decision? This is black and white. And so we began to study, you know, cognitive dissonance neuro implications. And we wrote about it in the third edition of the book, the eventual neuro impact of it experienced as cognitive decline. And so I'm going to just direct you. I'm not going to, you know, recreate those chapters here, except to say there's a lot of information about it. I am continuing to write series on cognitive dissonance that, and I occasionally will do a webinar or something on it. So just stay tuned to our website at saferelationships.magazine.com if you're interested, or our Facebook group, the Institute for Relational Harm Reduction.